On the 11th of November, 1834, a baronet's daughter named Charlotte Ainsley walked 4 frozen miles in thin evening slippers to reach the lit doors of Marchmont Hall. Her stepmother and 2 stepsisters held the carriage, the family name, and every shilling of her father's estate. Everyone expected her to be turned back at the servants' entrance before the first dance was called. What the Duke of Ravenswood did instead, before 300 guests who had never once troubled to learn her name, would be repeated in the drawing rooms of that county for 40 years. She had counted the ruts on that road as a child, riding it in her father's lap. At 6:30, the carriage had stood in the drive with its lamps burning and its door hanging open, and Lady Ainsley had looked at her once, the way a woman looks at a stain on a glove she intends to discard, and said, "There is no room." Her stepsister's skirts filled the seats like drifts of snow. Prudence did not lift her eyes from her fan. Augusta smiled and said, "You may follow, if you are able," and the footman, who had known Charlotte since she was 7, shut the door with a gentleness that shamed them both. So she walked. Frost cracked beneath her slippers within the first quarter mile, and after that she stopped feeling her ankles altogether. She held her mother's shawl closed at her throat, with fingers that had gone the color of candle wax, and she watched the windows of Marchmont Hall swim closer through the dark, gold and warm and full of music, that reached her thin and broken across the fields. Behind the yew hedge she scraped the mud from her hem with a stick, pinned her hair by touch, and told herself that no one would look at her long enough to notice. She had been overlooked in that county for 9 years. It had become a kind of shelter, but when the doors opened and the heat of 300 candles struck her wet skirts, one man across the room set down his glass. He had not danced in 6 years. He had not spoken to a woman at a public ball since the winter his brother died, and every mother in the province had learned to steer her daughters clear of him. Nobody could ever agree, afterward, on what he saw first, the ruined slippers, or the hem, or her hands. Only that he began, very deliberately, to cross the floor toward her. The assembly rooms at Whitcomb measured 90 feet from the musicians' gallery to the far windows, and the Duke of Ellesmere took his time over every one of them, long enough for the second violin to lose its place. Long enough for Lady Selby, seated in the best chair beneath the second chandelier with her fan spread like a peacock's tail, to follow the turning of heads and discover, with a small cold drop in her stomach, where they were turning to, and long enough for Clara Ainsworth to consider, seriously, whether she might step backward through the door she had just come through and be gone before he arrived. She did not because she could not. Her aunt had brought her here for a purpose, and the purpose required her to stand exactly where she had been put, 3 paces inside the room, beside the pillar, close enough to be summoned and far enough not to be seen. That was her station. She had held it at 9 winters of these assemblies. She knew the temperature of that particular strip of floor, the draft that came under the door and found her ankles, the way the candle wax dropped in slow tears from the sconce above, and had to be avoided or it would mark a sleeve. 9 years ago she had come into that county in a hired gig with 2 trunks and a birdcage with nothing in it. Her father had been a shipping clerk in Bristol who rose to a partnership and died before the papers were signed, and the men who came afterward were very polite and very thorough, and when they had finished being both, there was no house on Prince Street, no pianoforte, no burial plot beside her mother, and no money. There was a letter from her mother's elder sister, Augusta, now Lady Selby of Ashling Grange, offering shelter to her orphaned niece in terms so generous that Clara had wept over it in the coaching inn at Bath and kissed the paper. She had learned what the terms meant by the end of her first month. They meant she rose at 6 to check the still room. They meant she kept the household books because Sir Rowland could not be troubled with columns, and she kept them honestly, which was more than anyone else in that house had ever done. They meant she mended, and copied invitations, and read aloud until her voice went thin, and dressed her cousin's hair, and sat up with Georgiana through the scarlet fever the year the nursemaid ran off, and was thanked for none of it, because a debt cannot be repaid by the person who owes it, only performed, endlessly, in front of witnesses. They meant also that a legacy of £200 left to Clara by her mother had gone into Sir Rowland's keeping in trust, and that whenever she asked after it, twice in 9 years, both times in the study, both times with her hands folded, she was told the funds were placed advantageously and that gratitude sat better on a young woman than arithmetic. She had stopped asking. She had not stopped remembering the figure. 9 years is long enough to disappear on purpose. She had become expert at it. The gray gown, the lowered eye, the useful silence. When gentlemen came to the Grange, she carried the tea things and no one asked her name twice. When the neighborhood spoke of the Selby girls, they meant Cecily, who was handsome and knew it, and Georgiana, who was handsome and did not yet. Clara was the cousin who was so good with the accounts. Being overlooked had begun as a wound and settled, over the years, into something more like a roof. Thin, but it kept the worst of the weather off. And in 3 weeks it was to be taken from her, because Lady Selby had found her a situation. That was the word used at breakfast, 11 days ago, over the toast rack. A situation. An elderly invalid gentlewoman near Kirkby, in the north, who required a companion of quiet habits to read to her, and dose her, and sleep in the adjoining room. £40 a year. No visitors. Lady Selby had called it a kindness, and Cecily had said how lucky, and Clara had looked at the marmalade and understood that she was being posted to the far edge of England to be buried alive at 26, and that the arrangement had been made without one word of consultation, because no one consults a chair before moving it. So she had come to the ball. She had been ordered to come, to hold Cecily's spare gloves and Cecily's shawl, and to remember which of the Hale brothers had the 8,000 a year. And at 7:30 she had gone down to the sweep with the shawl over her arm, to find the carriage already turning out of the gates, and Cecily's hand withdrawing from the window, and her aunt's voice carrying back on the damp air, perfectly clear, perfectly cheerful. There is simply no room for her with the skirts. 4 miles along the Alder Road in a thin rain. She had walked it because to stay behind would have been reported as sulking, and sulking was the one crime in that house that carried a real sentence. Her slippers had gone at the first mile, the hem of the gray silk, her mother's gray silk, turned twice and let down and mended along the seam where the water had rotted the thread, had taken up 6 inches of the lane. She had stopped at the horse trough by the crossroads, scraped the mud away with a stick until her fingers were numb, pinned her hair by touch in the dark, and told herself the truth as she knew it, that no one in that room would look at her long enough to notice. She had been right about everything except one man. They said in that county that the Duke of Ellesmere had not accepted an invitation in 6 years. They said the west wing of Ellesmere Hall was shut and the mirrors in it covered. They said he had come home from London the winter his brother died and given orders that no music be played in the house, and that if you rode past the lake at dusk you could sometimes see him out on the water alone in a flat boat, doing nothing at all. Mothers steered their daughters away from him the way one steers a child from an open well, and there was a further rumor, older and stranger, which nobody could confirm, that somewhere behind those shut doors he kept a child that no one in the neighborhood had ever laid eyes upon. He was 6 feet of black coat and unhurried purpose, and he was now 4 steps away. The music had thinned to nearly nothing, 300 candles, and Clara could hear the wet leather of her own ruined slipper against the boards as she shifted her weight. Somewhere behind her, Cecily's fan had stopped moving entirely. He came to a halt 1 pace short of her, close enough that she saw the rain still beaded on his shoulders, and she understood with a slow horror that he had been out in the same weather she had. Then he said, quite clearly, so that the whole silent room heard it, "Miss Ainsworth," and that was impossible, because in 9 years, nobody in that county had ever bothered to learn her name. For a moment she could not make her mouth work. 9 years in that county, and she had been. The niece. The poor relation. The girl in gray. The one who does the accounts. She had been addressed as, "You there," by a footman who had known her since she was 15. Once, at the Michaelmas assembly, a woman in emerald silk had asked Aunt Lavinia whether the servants were permitted to sit down, and Lavinia had laughed and said nothing at all, and Clara had gone on holding Cecily's cloak. Now a duke had said her name, and 300 candles had all leaned in to listen. "Your Grace," she managed, and dipped, and her ruined slipper slid an inch on the wax so that the curtsy came apart at the bottom of it. She heard the small sound of the sole giving way, a wet seam, splitting. She felt the cold ring of water she had brought in with her, spreading in the shape of her own feet. He did not offer her his hand. He did not look at the slipper, which she thought afterward was the single kindest thing anyone had done for her in 9 years, though at the time it only frightened her more. "You walked," he said, not a question. She opened her mouth to answer it, to say something about the road being wet, about the hour, about nothing, and that was when Aunt Lavinia arrived, because Aunt Lavinia had spent 30 years learning to arrive at precisely the moment that mattered. "Your Grace is too good." Lavinia's hand closed around Clara's forearm through the wet wool, thumb pressed hard into the soft inside of it, the grip of a woman guiding a stubborn horse. "My husband's brother's child. She insisted on coming ahead with my daughter's shawl. Such devotion, quite unnecessary. We have people for it." "Your Grace has not met my Cecily. Cecily, come and be presented." And Cecily came, in ivory, dry to the hem, her fan folded now and her mouth arranged into something soft and sorry, and she said, "You must forgive Clara, Your Grace. She is not accustomed." The Duke looked at Cecily. It was the briefest look Clara had ever seen given to a beautiful girl. Then his eyes came back, and she waited, with a hope so sudden and so shameful that it felt like being ill, for him to say something, anything, that he had asked. Her. A question. That the shawl had come 7 miles in oilcloth while its owner rode. He said nothing. He inclined his head half an inch, and Lady Marchant swept in with a laugh and a hand on his sleeve and the words, "Supper." And the yellow room. And the black coat turned, and the music found its feet again, and the floor closed over the place where he had stood like water over a dropped stone. That was the whole of it. 11 words in a silent room, and then abandonment. But the room had heard her name now, and a name is a handle. A nameless drab in ruined shoes can be looked past. Miss Ainsworth. Spoken aloud, in that voice, in that particular silence, was a story, and by the time the fiddles reached the second figure, the story had been told badly in 11 separate corners of the ballroom, and in 9 of them Clara Ainsworth had thrown herself at the Duke of Ravensmere in the middle of a dance. Lavinia's grip did not loosen until the servants' passage, where the air smelled of tallow and hot silver polish, and there she let go and struck her once across the face with the flat of her hand, quickly, the way one might swat a fly off a cake. "Do you know," Lavinia said, "what your uncle has spent on that girl's season?" Clara did know. She kept the household book. She could have said the figure to the shilling. Lord Ferris is very nearly asked. Very nearly. 2 more weeks and it is settled, and there is nothing on God's earth I would not do for it. And you— Lavinia stopped, breathing, one hand flat against the wall. Down the passage a maid saw them and turned around and went the other way. "You come dripping into Lady Marchant's ballroom like a beggar at a wedding, and get yourself noticed." "I was sent for. You were sent to the kitchen door. It was bolted," Clara said. "I knocked for a quarter of an hour." Lavinia looked at her for a long moment, and something in her face settled, the way a ledger settles when a woman decides at last which column a thing belongs in. "The vicar's wife tells me you have been taking money for lessons," she said. "Reading, and the pianoforte. Since March." The passage went very cold. 14 shillings, Clara said. "And 6 pence. 19 shillings and 3 pence. I counted it this morning." Lavinia straightened her gloves. "It is in my desk. Consider it a small payment against 9 years of bread, and be grateful I do not tell your uncle you have been earning behind his back like a shop girl, because he would have you out of the house tonight and he would be within his rights. 19 shillings and 3 pence in a tea tin behind the loose brick in the still-room chimney. 2 years of it. Enough, in another 8 months, for a coach fare and a plain dress and the advertisement she had already written out and folded and never sent. A gentlewoman of 21 seeks a situation as instructress to young children, Bath or Bristol preferred. "Mr. Pell has spoken to your uncle," Lavinia went on, unhurried now, almost gentle. "The corn factor at Faring, 58, and a good house, and 3 children living. He is willing to overlook the want of a portion." She smoothed Clara's collar down where the rain had turned it dark, and her fingers were not unkind, and that was somehow the worst of it. "You will give him an answer by Sunday. It is more than you were ever going to be offered, and after tonight it is more than you deserve." Then she said, "The carriage is full going back. Cecily's gown will crush." And she went out through the green baize door into the light and the fiddles, and the door swung shut, and Clara stood in the passage with a handprint rising on her cheek, and 7 miles of black road ahead of her, and one slipper open at the sole like a mouth. She did not cry in the passage. She had learned years ago that crying inside a house is how a girl loses the last thing she has, which is being difficult to describe. She went out by the yard door instead, into the rain, past the row of waiting carriages with their lamps burning and their coachmen hunched under oilskins, and she was 30 yards down the gravel and already soaked through. When the first of the carriages came up behind her, lamps swinging, the horses going up in white breath, the wheels hissing on wet gravel like something drawing a long, slow breath through its teeth. She stepped onto the verge to let it pass. That was habit. She had been stepping aside for 9 years. Then the cold got into the hollow of her back and she thought of 7 miles, and she lifted her hand. It was the Harrogate coach, and the man on the box was old Dobbs, who had once carried a hare down to the kitchen for her when the cook had nothing but turnips, and who had said, that day, that a girl of 16 ought not to be that thin in a house with 3 cooks. He saw her. She knew he saw her, because the horses came down out of their trot and his shoulders turned in the oilskin and his mouth opened. And then the window came down. A gloved hand, a gleam of jet at a wrist. Lady Harrogate's face floated in the square of yellow lamplight, powdered smooth as a plate, and behind it another face, younger, curious, leaning to look. "Is that not the Ainsworth girl?" the young one said. "Out in this?" There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds. Clara has remembered those 2 seconds all her life. "That," said Lady Harrogate, "is nobody at all. Drive on, Dobbs." The window went up. Dobbs did not look at her again. He could not, and keep his place, and he had a wife and a bad hip and 11 years to go before the pension, and the wheel took the standing water at the edge of the drive and threw it up her skirt to the hip, and the lamps went away down the avenue and were swallowed by the beeches. The second carriage did not slow. The third slowed, and a man's laugh came out of it, and it did not stop. The fourth she did not signal, and the fifth she did not signal, and by the 6th she had stopped standing on the verge altogether and simply walked with her head down at the very edge of the road where the grass was, so that the wheels went by close enough to stir her hem. There is a particular arithmetic a woman does in the rain at midnight, and Clara did it now, and did it carefully, because being sensible was the only wealth she had ever been permitted to accumulate. 7 miles by the turnpike, past the lodge, down to the crossroads, up over Leadmore with the wind coming off it sideways, then the long descent into the village, and the last half-mile of lane. 7 miles in a thin gown, and 1 slipper that had opened at the sole like a mouth, or 5.5 if she cut down by the drover's track behind the lodge, through the withy beds, and crossed the beck on the stepping stones at Wexon. She had done it in August with a basket of eggs on her arm, and not one of them cracked. 5.5. An hour and a half of saving, and an hour and a half was the difference between arriving cold and arriving something worse. So she climbed the stile by the lodge wall and went down into the dark. The track was not a track anymore. It was a trough of liquid clay that took her to the ankle and then above it, and pulled at her with a soft, greedy sound each time she lifted a foot, and the slipper came apart properly there, the sole flapping loose, so that she stopped under a hawthorn and knelt in the mud and unthreaded the ribbon from her sleeve to bind it. Her fingers had gone stupid. She had to hold the ribbon in her teeth. She still had a needle in the seam of her bodice, threaded, from mending Cecily's hem in the ladies' cloakroom 2 hours before. 3 inches of Brussels lace that had cost more than every garment Clara owned laid end to end, and she remembered it now and thought, with the first small flare of something that was not patience, that she might have driven it into somebody's hand instead. The binding held 1/4 of a mile. She heard the beck before she saw it, and she knew, from the sound alone, before her mind would consent to know it. Wexon Brook in August is a thing a child crosses on 5 flat stones with a basket of eggs. Wexon Brook at midnight after 3 days of rain is 20 feet of brown water moving fast and silent in the middle and loud at the edges, and the stones were under it, and the willow she used to steady herself by was leaning out over the flood with its whips dragging. She tried it anyway. That is the part she never afterwards told anyone. She went into the knee, feeling with her ruined foot for the first stone, and found it, and found the second, and the water came up over her thigh and took hold of her with an enormous patient strength, like a hand closing round a bird, and turned her half about, and something in her, some animal older than her manners, said, "No." Very clearly, and she went back 3 steps and stood on the bank shaking with the cold running off her. The shorter way was shut, so the sensible arithmetic had cost her a mile down and a mile back and whatever heat she had left, and now it was 7 miles again from a place that was not the beginning. She sat on the stile at the top of the withy beds because her legs asked her to, and she allowed herself the length of 10 breaths, and in those 10 breaths she did the thing she had promised herself in the passage that she would not do. She thought about the doorway. Because earlier, before the carriage went without her, before the handprint, a man had stood in a doorway at the head of the great staircase with the light behind him and said one word, and the word had been her name, her real one, the one on the flyleaf of her mother's psalter, and 300 people had turned round to see who on earth he could be speaking to. Ainsworth. 9 years in that county, 9 years of being the cousin, the girl, the one who mends things, and a man she had never in her life been introduced to had known her name the way a man knows a name he has been carrying a long time. She did not let herself finish the thought. Warm thoughts in cold rain are a kind of poison. They make you sit. She got up. She was perhaps a mile along the turnpike, on the rise before Leadmore, when she noticed that the light behind her on the road was not going away. It was a single lamp, moving slowly, too slowly for a gentleman's coach going home from a ball, slow as a thing looking for something in the hedges, and she stepped down into the ditch grass to let it by, as she had all night, and turned her face away out of an old flinching instinct. It came level with her, and it stopped, and the door opened without a word spoken, and the rain hung in the lamplight like sparks, and Clara looked up at the panel of that door and saw the crest painted there, and every drop of blood she had left went out of her face. A hooded falcon, silver upon black, one talon closed over a broken leather jess, and beneath it 4 words worn thin by 80 winters of weather. I do not turn. Every child in that county knew the falcon. Grooms straightened when it passed. Farmers took their hats off in the lane and kept them off until the wheels had gone by. At her aunt's table it was spoken of in the particular hush reserved for money that could not be married into and tempers that could not be managed, and Clara had spent 9 years being told to keep well clear of it, as one keeps clear of a bull in a field. She did the only thing 9 years had taught her to do. She stepped further back into the ditch grass, gathered the ruined skirt of her mother's mended silk against her legs, and lowered her head. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I'm keeping to the side. You can pass." The rain filled up the silence. Inside the carriage there was nothing to see but the shape of a shoulder and the dull glint of a buckle, and then a voice came out of that dark, level, unhurried, with no apology anywhere in it. "Miss Ainsworth." Not a question. He said her name the way a man reads a line he has already read twice. Clara's throat closed. She had heard her name once before that night, spoken across 300 candles in a ballroom she had been permitted to stand at the edge of, and she had spent every mile since trying to persuade herself she had imagined it. Then the step came down, and the Duke got out into the rain. He did it without hurry and without ceremony, one gloved hand on the frame, and she noticed, because she noticed everything about powerful men, it was how she had survived them, that he came down carefully, favoring something, setting his weight on the left leg last, as though the last 4 inches cost him more than he cared to advertise. He was hatless. Within 5 seconds the rain had darkened his shoulders and flattened his hair, and he stood in 6 inches of turnpike mud in boots that were worth more than everything Clara owned, and looked at her. He looked at her hair pasted to her cheek, at the shawl gone black with water, at her feet. "Your Grace," the coachman said from the box, half rising appalled. "Be still, Harris." He turned back to her. "Get in." It came out flat as a closing door. Clara had been given orders in that tone all her life, and she had obeyed every one of them, and she heard herself say, "I can't." Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, interest perhaps, which frightened her considerably more. "You are 3 miles from anywhere," he said. "In February, in the dark, in what I assume were once slippers." "And in the morning," Clara said, The only thing anyone in this county will remember about me is that I was found on the Ledmore Road at midnight, getting into a duke's carriage alone. I've very little, your grace. I should like to keep the little I have." The rain came down between them, hanging in the lamplight like sparks, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Then he did the thing she would remember for the rest of her life, and think of at odd hours, and never be able to explain to anyone in a way that made it sound as enormous as it had been. He stripped off his greatcoat. "Then we shall not give them a carriage to talk about," he said. "Harris, drive on, take her home dry and wait at the gates. Your grace, the road is a road, drive on." He held the coat out at arm's length, held it out, so that she might take it or refuse it, and not draped about her as though she were a parcel to be wrapped. When she did not move, he stepped forward once, set it over her shoulders, and then stepped back further than propriety demanded, so far back that the rain filled the space between them like a chaperone. The carriage groaned past. The lamp went away up the rise, small and swinging, and took the last of the light with it, and Clara stood in the middle of the turnpike in a coat that came to her ankles and was still warm from another body, warm and smelling of wet wool and cedar and horse and, faintly, of ink, beside a man the whole county was afraid of, in the pitch dark, with 2.5 miles of gravel to go. "Which way?" he said. She pointed, he walked, and because he did not look back to see whether she followed, she followed. He took the outer side of the road without being asked, so that the ruts and the standing water and the mud thrown by any late wheels would come to him first. He did not offer his arm. He did not speak for 1/4 mile, and Clara, who had braced herself for interrogation, found the silence almost unbearable in a wholly different way, because in 9 years no one had walked beside her at all. Her left slipper had given up somewhere before Ledmore Rise. The sole had parted from the upper and slapped at every step, a small wet indignity announcing itself over and over in the dark. He heard it. He said nothing about it. He simply shortened his stride by perhaps 1/3 and kept it shortened the whole rest of the way, and never once turned his head to check whether she had noticed. "How far had you come?" he asked at last, "when I found you?" "A little over 1 mile. 3, he said. "You left the assembly rooms at 10:30. You came out by the stable arch and not the front steps, so as not to be seen going on foot." Clara stopped walking. "How do you know that?" The Duke kept going 3 paces, then halted with his back to her, rain running off his jaw. "Because I was standing at the stable arch," he said, "and you did not see me. Nobody ever does at that hour." "Your Grace," her voice came out thin, "how do you know my name?" "Nobody knows my name. I have been at every ball in this district for 9 years, and I have been the niece, and the companion, and the one who plays. For every one of them, and tonight a Duke I have never spoken to says, 'Clara Ainsworth,' across a crowded room as if I had reason to. As if you had known me a long while," she finished, and the words came out so quietly that a lesser man would have pretended not to hear them. He heard them. She watched him hear them. Something moved behind his face the way a lamp moves behind a shuttered window, a flare of light finding the gaps, and then it was gone, and he was again the man the whole county called cold, standing on the steps of a house he had not been expected to enter, with his hat in his hand and the rain drying off the shoulders of his coat. Below them, the sweep of gravel glittered where the puddles had begun to still. Carriages stood in a patient line, lamps burning, horses shifting their weight and steaming faintly in the cold. Clara looked for the one with the dented lamp bracket and the cracked left spring, the one her uncle refused to have repaired because nobody of consequence ever looked closely at a carriage. It was not in the line. It had not been in the line for an hour. Her aunt had taken her daughters home at midnight, and the footman had been given his instructions, and there had been no one left inside the ballroom to notice that the woman at the pianoforte had nothing to be carried home in. "They have gone," she said. "There is no need for you to stand here. It is 2 miles by the Marlow Road, and I know every stone of it. You walked here." "I did. In this. The rain came after," she said, which was a lie, and they both knew it was a lie, because her hem hung heavy with chalk mud, and the ribbon of one slipper had been retied in a knot no lady's maid would have permitted. The butler appeared behind them with the particular hush of a man who has smelled a scandal and wishes to be well placed for it. "Your Grace, shall I have your carriage brought round?" "Bring it round," the Duke said. "Then tell Hallett to drive it behind us at 50 paces, with both lamps lit. all the way to Mr. Ainsworth's gate. The butler blinked. "Behind, your grace?" "Empty," said the Duke, "so that every window in this house will have something worth watching." Clara felt the blood come up into her face, and then, strangely, out of it again, leaving her light and cold and steady. She had spent 9 years learning to be invisible with grace. She had no training whatever for this. He offered his arm. She looked at it for the space of 3 breaths. The black sleeve, the plain glove, the absolute stillness of it, a thing offered without impatience, as though he were prepared to stand on those steps until dawn. And then she put her hand on it, and they went down into the wet gravel together, while behind them the music started up again, for a dance neither of them would see. The lane past the gates was hooded with hedges, and the mud there was the pale, slick chalk of that country, and it clung. The carriage came behind them exactly as he had commanded, 2 coach lamps swinging in the dark like a pair of slow yellow eyes, near enough to light the ruts, and far enough that the coachman could not hear a word. It was the most extraordinary escort Clara had ever imagined, and it was hers, and she could not think of a single thing to say. She limped at the 4th milestone. She had thought she had hidden it. The right slipper had worn through under the ball of her foot on the walk out, and the blister had opened somewhere during the last set, and the silk of her stocking had gone stiff and wet in a way she preferred not to consider. She did not mention it. He did not mention it either. He simply shortened his stride, not obviously, not with any ceremony, the way a man shifts a candle so it stops shining in someone's eyes, and kept it shortened for the rest of the road. That was the moment, she thought later, though nothing at all had happened in it. "You will be talked of," she said, "by noon tomorrow. They will say the Duke left the Farleys' ball to walk home with the poor relation who plays for other girls' dances. They will say I walked you home," he said. I would like them to say it correctly. At the almshouses, the second cottage still had a rushlight burning, and old Sarah Dunn was at her door with a shawl over her head, watching the strange lamps come up the lane, and she called out in her cracked voice, "Is that Miss Clara?" "Miss Clara," the poultice held. "Tell your good lord I said the poultice held." "I am glad of it, Sarah," Clara called back. "Bar your door, it is nearly 2. They walked on, 20 paces, 40. "Nobody knows your name," the Duke said. Clara said nothing at all. "There is a woman in a nightgown at 2 o'clock in the morning who knows your name," he said, "and there are, I am told, 11 others between here and the church who know it, and a boy at the smithy who broke his wrist in September and knows it, and a curate who cannot read his own accounts and knows it. It is only that particular ballroom which has agreed not to." "Agreed," she repeated. "Agreements of that kind are always made by somebody," he said. "They do not arise from the air." The gate of her uncle's house came up out of the dark, the 2 brick pillars, the missing finial, the drive with its ruts full of sky. There was a lamp burning in the drawing room, which meant her aunt was awake, which meant her aunt had heard the carriage. The curtain there moved once and settled. He stopped at the gate. He did not open it. "Miss Ainsworth," he said, "when you go in, your aunt will ask you what possessed you. Before you answer her, ask her one thing for me." "Ask her what?" The coach lamps behind them threw his face half in gold and half in nothing. "Ask her what became of the letters," he said. 9 of them, sent to this house, thing you, by name, between the March of 1813 and the January after. Ask her, and watch her hands when she answers. Clara's fingers had gone entirely numb on the cold iron of the gate. "What letters?" she said. "Your Grace, whose letters?" "Ask her tonight," he said, and stepped back, and put on his hat. "Then ask me at 11, when I call." He did not look back. Clara stood with her bare hands still closed round the wet iron of the gate long after his footsteps had thinned into the fog at the end of the street, and what she noticed, absurdly, was the evenness of them, the unhurried tread of a man who had never once in his life been obliged to run. Then the fog took even that, and she was alone with 15 steps of gravel between herself and the door. The house was lit as though for a celebration, which in a sense it was. Every candle in the front room burning at once, the good ones, the wax not tallow. When she let herself into the hall, the air came at her warm and thick with the leavings of the evening. Orange peel, hot candle grease, the violet water her elder stepsister wore too much of, and there on the bench beneath the coats lay the carriage rug, folded, still holding the shape of somebody's knees. Clara put 2 fingers on it. It was warm. She had walked 3 miles in dancing slippers to reach a ballroom that rug had carried them to in comfort, and the warmth of it was the last small cruelty of a very long night, and she found she did not mind it at all. She had something else to carry now, 9 letters. He had said the number the way a man says a thing he has counted himself. They were all 3 in the drawing room, boots off, stays loosened, the tea things sent up because none of them could sleep after such an evening. Her stepmother sat nearest the fire with her work basket at her feet and a cup balanced on the arm of the chair, and she was in the middle of a sentence about Lady Marrow's disgraceful ostrich plumes when Clara came in with her hem hanging heavy and black with road water. "Good heavens," said the younger stepsister, "she's walked." "She has walked," her stepmother agreed, not looking up. "She has walked, and she has been seen walking, and tomorrow the whole parish will know that a girl from this house went about the county on foot like a tinker's child. You have a gift, Clara. You truly have a gift for making a spectacle of yourself." "Someone walked with me," Clara said. The teacup went on turning slowly in her stepmother's fingers. A groom, I imagine. The Duke. The turning stopped. Clara had watched that face for 11 years, had learned it the way a sailor learns a coastline, every reef of it, every place where the ground fell away, and she had never once thought to watch the hands. She watched them now. Her stepmother set the cup down, and set it down badly, so that it rang against the saucer. Then the hands went to the fringe of her shawl and straightened it, then to her throat. Then they folded themselves in her lap, very still, stiller than hands ever are, 2 dead birds in a nest of black silk. "He asked me to ask you something," Clara said, "about 9 letters, sent to this house, addressed to me by name, between the March of 1813 and the January after." The elder stepsister laughed. It came out a half-beat too soon, and too high, and died in the middle. "There were no letters," her stepmother said. "March of 1813, Clara said, "the month we buried Papa. There were no letters, 9 of them. There were, a breath, no, letters. And there it was, the thing the Duke had known she would find, the thing he had walked 3 miles in the wet to hand her. Not a confession. A denial delivered in 3 pieces by a woman whose hands would not move. "Go to bed," her stepmother said. "You are wet through and you are not well, and you have imagined a great deal of nonsense out of the civility of a great man who was being kind to a drab in the road. Go to bed, Clara." Clara went. She climbed the stairs with her candle and her ruined slippers in her fist and her heart going like a hammer under her stays, and she got as far as the second landing before she understood what the smell was. Burning paper does not smell like burning wood. It is a sweeter, dirtier smoke, and under it, faint and unmistakable, comes the tallow and honey stink of sealing wax gone soft in a flame. The door of her stepmother's bedchamber stood a hand's breadth open. Inside, kneeling on the hearthrug in her wrapper with her gray plait down her back, that same woman was feeding paper into the grate, not throwing it, feeding it, sheet by sheet, holding each one down with the poker until the flame had properly taken it, because she had done it before, and she knew that paper burns badly when it is bundled. The rosewood writing box that always sat locked on the mantel stood open at her elbow. It was very nearly empty. Clara did not remember crossing the room. She remembered the poker coming up, and her stepmother's shout, high and wordless, more animal than any sound she had made in 11 years of small, refined cruelties. She remembered the heat and the shock of the pain, and the paper tearing under her fingers as she dragged a half-burnt sheet out of the fire and clapped it against her own wet skirt to kill the flame, and the smell of scorched wool, and her thumb screaming. She remembered her stepmother on her knees on the hearthrug saying, over and over, "You were 16. You were 16 years old, you stupid, stupid girl," and he was... And then she stopped. She stopped as though a hand had been laid over her mouth. That was the part Clara would think of afterwards, in the years when all of this had become a story told at other people's tables, not the fire, and not the poker, but the way the sentence broke, and the way the woman's eyes went to the clock on the mantel, and the way the fear in them changed shape. Because the clock said 4 minutes before 11. Clara backed out of the room with the ruined page pressed to her breast, its edge crumbling black onto her bodice, her thumb blistering white. She got to the top of the stairs. She got the candle steady, she turned the paper over, and the writing was a strong, sloped, impatient hand she had never in her life seen before, and there were only 9 words left unburnt at the top of it. "Miss Clara, if this is the last, then no." Downstairs, the front door knocker fell twice, and then a third time, unhurried, the knock of a man who had never in his life been left standing on a step. Clara came down 2 stairs before the drawing room door opened beneath her, and her stepmother walked out into the hall with ash on her cuff. "Go up." She did not look up the staircase. She knew precisely where Clara stood, the way she always knew, the way a keeper knows which stall the mare is in. "Go up, shut your door, and do not come down until I send for you." He asked to call at 11. He asked nothing of you. Her stepmother drew off one glove, then thought better of it, and drew it on again. "You will find, Clara, that men of that rank ask a great deal of the air in a room, and nothing whatever of the furniture in it. Jem, the door. Count 5 before you open it." Clara did not go up. She went back 3 steps and stood in the dark bend of the staircase where the wall met the banister, the place she had learned as a girl of 11, the place from which a person may hear everything in that hall and be seen by nobody. She pressed the ruined page flat against her bodice. Her thumb had begun to swell where the coal had kissed it. The smell of burnt paper came up the stairs after her stepmother like a scent she had put on deliberately. The door opened, rain came in first, and the sound of it on the flags, and then a voice she had heard exactly once, low and unhurried, and entirely without apology. "Mrs. Ainsworth, I am expected." "You are punctual, Your Grace. My husband used to say punctuality in a great man is a species of threat. Your husband was seldom wrong. Is Miss Ainsworth at home?" There it was, her name in his mouth, plain, unornamented, spoken as though it were an address he had written 100 times and never once needed to check. Clara's knees went to water. She put her palm flat to the cold wall and held there. "She is not," said her stepmother. Silence in the hall, rain on the flags. Somewhere above, the small, mean creak of a stepsister leaning further out to listen. "Then I will wait." "You will not, and I say so kindly, for your own dignity's sake." Paper moved. The dry, deliberate rustle of a sheet unfolded and held out at arm's length. "She left this with me at 4 o'clock, and asked me to give it into your hand and to spare her the interview. She is a coward in these matters." "She has always been a coward. She feared you would be gentle with her, and that she would falter." A long pause. Long enough for Clara to understand what she was hearing and to be unable, physically unable, to move her feet. She wrote this: "At that desk, in this house, this morning, you will know the hand." "I know the hand." Something changed in his voice then, a hairline crack running through granite, and it was the worst sound Clara had ever heard, worse than laughter, worse than the door of a carriage shutting in a courtyard while she stood in the rain in her dead mother's shoes. She names a date. The 11th. "Mr. Pettifer is a plain man and a patient one, and he has held her father's debts these 4 years without once pressing us. Some women want candles and quartets. Some want to be safe. A rustle, the paper taken back, then given again. Keep it if you like. She thought you might wish to." "No," a breath. "Yes, I will keep it. Your Grace, then I have trespassed upon your evening, madam. I am sorry for it." Boots on the flags. The door. And afterward, Clara heard this and did not understand it for weeks. No carriage. No step let down. No coachman spoken to. No wheels turning out of the square. Only a man's tread going away along the wet pavement, bareheaded, without hurry. The sound of it growing thinner as he went, until the rain closed over it the way water closes over a dropped stone. Clara stayed at the window long after there was nothing left to hear. The square below held one lamp still burning at the corner, its light lying on the wet flags in a long yellow smear, and the smear was empty. A duke had come to that door on his own 2 feet and gone away again the same, and no one in the house would ever believe it, because no one in the house could imagine a man of 40,000 a year with mud to the ankle of his boot. She turned back to the table. The thing he had left lay where he had put it, exactly where the candle's light reached and stopped, a folded paper, thick as 3 letters pressed together, sealed with gray wax and bearing no direction whatsoever. Not her name, not his. "Keep it," he had said, in that low, flat voice that never rose and never asked twice, "and do not open it. If a day comes when you must, you will know the day without being told." She sat with it in her lap for the better part of an hour, listening to the gutters run. Then she took her needle case from the shelf, unpicked 6 inches of the lining of her gray cloak, the same cloak, the hem of it still stiff with the mud of the Wexham Road, still smelling faintly of wet wool and coal smoke, and sewed the paper in flat against the wool, at the left side, where the seam ran under the arm. When she had finished, she put the cloak on to test it. The paper lay against her ribs. She could feel the corners of it when she breathed, and she found she did not mind. The family came home at 2:30. She heard the carriage before she heard them, the good carriage, the one with the crest freshly picked out in gold that autumn, wheels ringing on the stones with the arrogance of a thing paid for on credit, and then the door, and then the voices coming up through the floor, bright and hard and pleased with themselves. Her stepmother's laugh, the elder girl complaining that the supper room had been too warm, the younger insisting twice that Lord Bexley had looked at her over the card table for a full minute together. At 3 the summons came. Clara went down in her shawl with her hair in a plait and stood in the doorway of the small parlor while her stepmother sat unpinning her turban before the glass. "Dobbs says a gentleman called." "Yes, ma'am." "And what name did he leave?" Clara watched the pins go one by one into the little china dish, each with its small click, like rain finding a window. Her stepmother did not turn round. The glass gave back a face still flushed from the supper room. Powder settled into the creases beside the mouth. "He left none, ma'am. Dobbs says he gave none." How fortunate for us all. The turban came away, and the thin gray hair beneath it was flattened into the shape of the evening. "He gave none because he has had his answer already." Clara crossed the carpet. She set the piece of paper down on the dressing table, beside the dish of pins, where the candle would light it, a corner of a sheet, browned along one edge where the flame had taken it and let it go. "Miss Clara, if this is the last, then no." Nothing after that. The rest of it was ash in the grate upstairs, along with 7 little pooled buttons of black sealing wax, cooled hard in the cinders, which was how she had known how many there had been. Her stepmother's hand stopped in the air. "You burned them," Clara said. "I disposed of rubbish. 7 times. You have been counting wax." The hand came down, quite steady. "How like you?" "And the 8th you answered." Clara heard her own voice come out level, which surprised her, because inside her chest something had begun to shake and had not stopped since 2 o'clock. "In my hand, or something near enough to it. You wrote to him in my name." For a moment the room held nothing but the candle guttering in its draught, and downstairs, faintly, the elder girl calling for hot water that would not come until 6. Then her stepmother turned on the stool and looked at her fully, and Clara saw that she was not ashamed. She was pleased. That was the thing that would stay longest. Not the cruelty, which was old and familiar as the stair carpet, but the pleasure sitting openly in a woman's face at 4 in the morning. "I wrote what any sensible guardian would write, that you were grateful for his notice and had no wish for its continuance, that you were shortly to be settled elsewhere." She smoothed the tape of her cap. "Do you imagine a man of that rank walks a girl through the rain for love of her? He walked you home for the novelty of it. Men of that kind collect a thing, and look at it, and set it down. I have spared you 8 months of hoping and 1 lifetime of being laughed at, and you will thank me for it before you are 30. "He came to the door tonight," Clara said, and went away again. The pleasure deepened. "Bareheaded, Dobbs tells me, like a tradesman. He will not come a second time." Clara said nothing. She had been taught silence in that house the way other girls were taught the harp, and she used it now, and she watched her stepmother reach past the pins for the little glass of ratafia and drink it down in one motion, the way she took her medicines, and set the glass back upon the tray with a small click she plainly intended as punctuation. "You may go up," her stepmother said, and turned back to the glass to loosen the last pin. Clara went up. 3 flights, the last of them narrow, to the room above the back stair where the fire had not been lit since October. She set her boots side by side on the boards to dry and looked at the ring of yellow mud on her hem, a 1.5 miles of road printed there like a signature, and she did not weep, because weeping in that house had never once been useful. She unhooked her gown. She folded her stockings. She listened to the square go quiet. At 11:30 there was a tap at the door, so light she thought at first it was the sash. Dobbs stood there with a candle shielded in her palm, 30 years in that house on her face, her apron still on. She did not come in. She reached into the apron pocket and brought out a card and held it forward on her flat hand like something that might scald. The card was scorched brown along one corner where the fire had begun and been interrupted. The engraving on the face of it was as plain as a gravestone. On the back, in pencil, in a hand that pressed too hard: "The Lending Library, Bridge Street, 11 o'clock. I will wait until they put out the lamps." "It came out of the grate before it caught, miss," Dobbs said. "I have burned a great many things in this house because I was told to. That one I did not," and she went away down the stairs without waiting to be thanked, which was its own kind of kindness. In the morning, Clara asked leave to return a book, and was given it because no one in that parlor could imagine a book mattering. She walked the 1.5 miles. The rain had stopped in the night and left the road silver, and she went in past the subscription desk into the smell of dust and glue and old leather, and he was standing at the end of the shelves with his hat in his hand and no servant anywhere near him, reading nothing at all. "She sent word that you were not at home," he said. "She is not my mother, no." He turned the hat once in his fingers. "She told me I would not come a second time. She believes it still. Then she has mistaken me for a man who is easily discouraged, and I have been called many things but never that." He looked at her then, and the coldness the whole county feared in him was nowhere in his face. "I have come a second time. I will come a third and a 30th. If you tell me to stop, I will stop, and I will not hold it against you, and you will never hear my name in this town again. But you must be the one who says it, not her." Clara stood with the returned book still in her hands, because she had not been offered a place to set it down, and she thought of the assembly room steps and the sound of her own footsteps arriving alone. "Then come tomorrow," she said, "and come to the front door, and let her see you do it." He came at 3 the next afternoon, in daylight, with 2 horses and a footman, and the crest on the panel where every window in the square could read it. Her stepmother received him in the good parlor with the best cups and a graciousness that would have curdled milk. He was not rude to her, he was worse, he was exact. He asked, quite pleasantly, whether it was true that no carriage had been available to the young lady on the night of the winter assembly. Her stepmother said the horses had been lame. He said he was glad to hear it, since a lame horse is a thing that can be mended, and he had feared it was something else. The betrothal was in the newspaper on a Tuesday. Clara's stepsisters read it aloud twice, once to be sure, and once because the elder could not make it come out differently. And 3 weeks later Clara walked into those same assembly rooms on his arm, past the doorway where she had stood in December with her hem dripping onto the marble while silk went by her on both sides, and the room came to its feet the way a field goes over in wind. Her stepmother curtsied to her, low, and held it. Clara reached down and took the woman's hand and raised her out of it. "You need not," she said, "not to me. There are those in that county who will tell you it was the cruelest thing she ever did, and they are not entirely wrong. They were married in the spring in a small church with the doors open to the wet, and Dobbs came with her, and would not be made housekeeper, and took charge of the linen instead, because linen, she said, does not answer back. The younger stepsister was given a music master and, in time, a modest match and a modest happiness, and wrote letters that were awkward and honest. The elder went to Bath and married comfortably, and never once mentioned the assembly. And Clara's stepmother stayed in the house on the square with an allowance paid quarterly by a lawyer's clerk who was instructed never to say from whom, and by the second year she had begun to tell callers that she had always encouraged the match, that she had seen it coming, in fact, from the very first evening. Whatever he had told Clara in the rain that night, somewhere between the 4th milestone and the turning of the square, he never repeated to another living soul. She never asked him to, but for as long as he lived, he did not once send a carriage for her that he was not sitting in himself. Years on a wet evening in March, that carriage stopped on the Bridge Street Road. There was a girl walking the verge with a bandbox and a music case and a hem already heavy with water, going the 7 miles to Hartlebury on foot, because the family that had engaged her to teach their daughters the pianoforte had not thought a music mistress worth the trouble of horses. The carriage drew up. The girl stepped back into the hedge, the way one does before something grander than oneself. "How far?" Clara asked. 7 miles, Your Grace. It is nothing." "It is 7 miles, Clara said, and opened the door. The girl protested that her hem would spoil the cushions. The Duke was already down in the road by then, hatless, taking the bandbox from her arms as though it were a thing of value, and he handed her up into his own place with the small formal courtesy he had never once spent on anyone who could repay it. Then he shut the door and walked, 2 miles of it, to the Hartlebury gates alongside the wheel, with the lamp swinging and the rain silvering his shoulders, while inside the girl sat too frightened to lean back. She told that story for 60 years. Few believed her, but the last thing she remembered of it was not the great house, nor the gates. It was a gloved hand resting on the window ledge from within, and a man walking beside it in the wet, keeping pace.